Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, everyone, the alternate history podcast. It's Dylan in the host chair today, taking the what if machine on the way back to continue a fork that we started, I believe, a couple weeks ago. And we are continuing our exploration of what would happen if Lyndon Johnson had not been elected as part of his 1948 Senate campaign. What happens without this kind of titanic figure in American politics on the stage going forward. So just as a quick recap of kind of what got us here, 1948, Johnson is running against outgoing governor of Texas, Coke Stevenson, for the Democratic primary for the open Texas Senate seat. At this point, the Democratic primary basically is the election. So whoever wins this basically has the formal election in the bag. Jim Wells County, Box 13, there's a bunch of pretty obviously fake voter registrations and votes that are discovered in this timeline. Unlike in the real timeline, those votes are immediately discounted and basically Coke Stevenson wins the election, whether Johnson takes it up to the court, whether they just immediately throw them out as obviously invalid, whatever. Johnson loses in 48. Coke Stevenson becomes senator. Without Johnson in the Senate, you have a couple of things that happen over the course of the 50s. You have kind of a more traditional and kind of almost stodgy Senate because Johnson's reforms really kind of began the process of turning the U.S. Senate into kind of what we recognize it as today, which is a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more egalitarian in the Senate structure. Back then, it was very much about seniority. It was very rigid. It was very hard as a new senator to break in to kind of the inside club of influential senators. So without Johnson, that's very much still the case. The more seniority you have, the more important you are, and that's basically it. The super senior senators on committees take everything. You also, without Johnson, have probably a very much neutered, if it's even passed at all, 1957 Civil Rights Act, because without Johnson kind of straddling the Dixiecrat Southern Democrats and the progressive New Deal Democrats, you don't have anybody who's leading the Senate that can really thread the needle and get some kind of compromise bill that has any kind of real merit passed. So if there is a 57 Civil Rights Act, and there probably is just so that they can say they passed something, it is very watered down, even compared to what it was in our timeline. And you also, and this was kind of the fun one from last episode, NASA's in Biloxi, because Johnson is one of the ones who really got the National Aeronautics and Space Act, which created NASA, off the ground in 1958. So we thought that something kind of similar happens in our timeline, but NASA kind of begins more in its original military R&D roots. And Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi is where a lot of the electrical and mechanical engineering trainees for the Air Force are trained. So that kind of makes it a natural point. Also in the Gulf, so when rockets splash down, they can go in the water. And that kind of area is also very kind of swampy, like Louisiana. So even if it hits land, it's still going to sink and splash.
As I've always explained to people, like thinking about the Manhattan Project or things like this, you want to know why they built uranium enrichment in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and plutonium out in like Eastern Washington? It's because when it goes south, nobody would be able to tell the difference.
Yeah, it's why they did the tests in Los Alamos, because there's nobody out there. So if something blows up, all you're doing is hurting some goats. So yeah, that was the
or gators. Gators.
Or gators.
The difference is what animal we're hurting if something goes wrong. Yes,
exactly. Dinosaurs or hairy four-legged cloven-hoofed animals. But the biggest thing that we think really kind of changes about this timeline is who Kennedy picks in 1960 as his running mate. And we settled on William Fulbright, who is a senator from Arkansas. He's a former university president, and he kind of helps bridge the same sort of Southern Democratic
sectarian divide.
Yeah, thank you. He's kind of a segregationist, but not really. He's kind of segregationist in the sort of same way that pretty much all Democrats, unless you were really progressive New Dealer, were kind of segregationists. But he's not a Strom Thurmond or George Wallace.
He's a Southern Democrat as opposed to being a Northern Democrat. If you were a Northern Democrat, you could be very progressive. Yeah,
but he's a Southern Democrat that doesn't have the kind of odiousness of that super harsh segregation. You know, he's not spending 24 hours on the Senate floor filibustering. And Fulbright also has some foreign policy credos from some of his prior government work that help Kennedy in an election that's going to be all about the Cold War and is going to be against probably the number 2 Cold Warrior of the age, Richard Nixon, second only to the man he served as vice president for, Dwight Eisenhower. So that's what the election's going to be about. So Fulbright helps this freshman senator from New England have a kind of believable foreign policy expertise platform. And interestingly enough, and this will come up later, Fulbright was originally Kennedy's choice for Secretary of State. So this is a guy Kennedy wanted in his cabinet. He was just talked down by some people on his team. And Dean Rusk, I think, is who he picked.
Yes, it was Dean Rusk.
State. Yeah.
Yes.
So in this situation, Kennedy has his guy that he really wants in his cabinet, and as vice president, he's with him from the campaign trail forward, even earlier than he would have been if he was put on as Secretary of State. Like, he's in the beginning, in the very formations of the foundation of this kind of presidential platform and administration. So with that, I think we pretty clearly said that Kennedy probably does still win the 60 election. And then that kind of just got us started. It's early 1961. Kennedy's been sworn in with Fulbright as his vice president. And those of you who know 1960s history may remember that very spicy things are about to start happening.
I mean, so by the way,
what's first up on the docket?
By the way, hi, good people. This is Chris.
Oh, I'm sorry, Chris.
Yeah, don't worry. I understand that since you don't have a catchphrase yet, listeners, please send in suggestions. Please send in suggestions.
I'm not saying in no particular order that I skipped everything that usually goes after that.
I get it. Dylan's just jealous because he doesn't have a catchphrase. So, by the way, a lot of stuff is about to happen. We ourselves had to sit down and make sure we're getting these in the right chronological order. Basically,
they're all happening just right after another.
Yes, and sometimes simultaneously.
Yeah, exactly.
The one thing I do feel kind of like mentioning before I get into it, a lot of times people look at the Johnson-Kennedy ticket as balancing kind of the foreign policy person with the domestic policy person. And I think I've made my feelings about Kennedy pretty clear in the podcast. But we talked about this earlier. What are the domestic accomplishments of the administration? And we had to kind of sit back and pause for a second because this is the Cold War. Everything we're talking about happening, all of the activity, all of the political issues are all foreign policy.
Yeah.
So first one to come up is in April 61. Basically, the Bay of Pigs invasion in our timeline happens. And we think it doesn't. I believe in talking to Dylan before becoming a senator. Before running for the House in the first place, Fulbright was the president of the University of University of Arkansas. And if there's one thing that university administrators do, it's their homework. Unlike other university administrators who have run for president,
And have shown Birth of the Nation in the White House.
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson, friend of the pod, everyone.
Check that off your Yeah, I have some economic policy coming up with the steelworkers strike in '62. Don't worry. So he does his homework, and if you know, in our timeline, and we'll get into this a little bit later, Fulbright was very important in supporting the Gulf of Tonkin resolution until he did his homework. And he talked to, as kind of a Europeanist, he talked to some French people who might have learned a couple of things in the 10-year
in the long
war,
history of Indochina,
or the 10-year war they fought there. And when he did his digging, he basically came to the conclusion that this is not a good idea. And if you looked at, even in the in the lead up to the Bay of Pigs, David Shoup, who, I did one of my things that Dylan doesn't know where I'm going with this. Hold on for a second, folks. Shoup was the commandant of the United States Marine Corps. He had been the commander at Tarawa. So you think he knows a thing or two about amphibious invasions? He was openly out there saying, this is a horrible idea. This will not work the way you're proposing it. And that was before Kennedy started messing around with it. And I think, as, again, somebody who's not going to fall for the Goldilocks trick of somebody coming in and saying, well, here's option A, here's option C, here's option B, when I want you to pick option B just blindly. He's actually going to do his homework and realize, wait a minute, these are a bunch of inexperienced frat boys from Yale who have never actually done this. And because that's kind of what the CIA was at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And just put the kibosh on it because he doesn't see an urgency in overthrowing Castro. Is that a fair statement, Dylan?
Yeah, and I think it really comes down to a couple. I think the fact that he's a university professor and does his homework is a big thing, and also the fact that Fulbright was this very pure European-focused Cold Warrior. Like he sees the Cold War as the U.S. versus Russia, not necessarily a capitalism versus communism fight, because Russia is the big motivating power, regardless of which interpretation you take. So he's focused on Europe. He's focused on Russia. The other thing that I think Fulbright, more than a lot of these CIA guys will see, is Castro's only been in charge of Cuba for 2 years. Like, the revolution happens in late 59. At this point, when the Bay of Pigs in our timeline kicks off, Castro hasn't even formally canceled the elections for that year yet. He does it like the next month or two. But at this point, Castro is still going through the motions of there will be elections. So this is a very new regime. And Fulbright, I think, is going to be of kind of the camp of, look, okay, yes, Cuba nationalized all the oil interests that we have down there. We don't like that. Americans love our oil. But we've issued an embargo. Let's give that time to see what happens. Let's see if it's got teeth in it before we go completely overboard. I know we've got all these mercenaries down in Nicaragua that we've trained under Eisenhower and all that, but let's let this simmer and see what happens before we decide where we've got to go further. Because again, Cuba is kind of a sideshow in his view. And he always was kind of against this intervention against Cuba. He actually, in our timeline, tried to tell Kennedy, hey, don't listen to these guys, don't do this. But since he wasn't in the administration.
And as vice president, he has access to a lot more people. I mentioned Shoup earlier. He's commandant of the Marine Corps at this point. He's not exactly out there talking to even the Senate Foreign Relations Committee president. But
But
if you're
he's
a
going to
vice
be in
president,
like
right,
XCOM and some of these other planning
right,
committees with the Joint Chiefs and stuff. Yeah.
right.
And so I think with Fulbright both on the scene when he wasn't and being in kind of the president's inner circle, I think he acts as a much more moderating influence. Because you also have to remember, Kennedy has only been in office for like 3 months. So he's
Mhm.
having to pick up all the pieces of this plan that's been cooking for 2
Hey,
years. And
by
he's
the way,
basically playing catch up.
yeah, you also made a point of talking about Kennedy initially wanted him as Secretary of State. Hey, you know what presidents are doing in the first couple of months of their administration? Actually getting their cabinet confirmed.
Yeah, exactly. So Kennedy, I think it makes a lot of sense for Babe Pigs not to happen because Fulbright's going to have this influence that moderates against intervention. And also we just have to recognize that Kennedy's going to, especially with Fulbright trying to talk him down, he's going to be probably okay with that because he's got so much other stuff that he's got to get done to get up and running. The last thing he wants to do is pull the trigger on a kind of half-baked invasion he's still getting up to speed on that was from the prior administration. It's like, okay, we've got the embargo in place. We can always invade Cuba 6 months from now because the Guatemalan mercenaries we're training aren't going anymore. Let's just chill out for a minute and see what happens. So I think Babe Pigs just straight up doesn't happen, at least in April 61 when it is in our timeline. It might happen later down. I don't think we've really decided. But at least for 61 and 62, while other things are going on, there are no little Cuban men landing in the Bay of Pigs.
Whew. So, and the important thing about that is we did mention things are happening very quickly now. If you delay that even a little bit, other things
It takes
become
a sideshow.
important.
Yeah, it becomes second fiddle to a whole lot of stuff.
For example, the Vienna meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev, which so the thing about that is it's important because one, Kennedy is coming right off of Bay of Pigs. He's semi-weakened or distracted or something about that. It's 2 months afterwards. It's in June of 61. And this is kind of the first chance for Khrushchev to get the measure of Kennedy, and he takes two things away from it. One, he looks at Kennedy and says, "This guy's younger than my son." Two, he thinks Kennedy's a lightweight.
Yeah.
He thinks he's adventurous, and he doesn't have the gravitas that, I don't know, a Fulbright brings to the table. The important part of that is Khrushchev looks at this and says, hey, he's not up to this. He's not there yet. But he's young and dynamic, which means I need to do something before he does get up to speed.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about Vienna in this timeline is if you don't have the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev still has that impression of Kennedy, but he doesn't have the track record that he can look at of, oh, this president's been in office for 3 months and he's already tried a half-baked invasion. I do think Khrushchev still thinks very little of Kennedy other than recognizing him as like a flashy showman president. But I think in this timeline, Khrushchev would recognize there is at least a little bit of a question mark because he doesn't know what – he's got his impression of Kennedy, but he doesn't really know what Kennedy's going to do.
And the other thing that's going through my mind, and please understand, everybody, I am pulling this on Dylan on the fly.
What's new?
In previous meetings between the United States and the Soviet Union, it had been four-party talks. It had been in, I believe it was Paris in the mid-'60s. John Foster Dulles met with Molotov, met with representatives from Britain and France as well, because this was kind of the occupation of Germany group. And we're going to get to Germany. Germany's very important here. I'm wondering if Fulbright kind of talks to Kennedy and says, we need to present a united Western Front to Khrushchev. So we need to be having representatives from Great Britain. Not quite sure who.
I think there is a French. I think still. I don't think the French had handed off their occupation zone.
Oh
yet.
no,
Yeah.
no. None of them had. I mean, it's kind of developing West Germany, but still, it's four-party talks, and I think that might be important, especially for Berlin.
Yes. And I think especially from Fulbright, because he's already an Anglophile. Like even back in World War II, he was a big proponent of aid, to Europe, but specifically to Britain. So
Britain was the only one left.
Well, yeah. I think especially he's going to want the Brits at the table as what he sees as the natural European ally against Russia going back to the world wars. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. And that I think changes some of the tenor of the talks in Vienna, especially from Khrushchev's perspective, because everything that happens after Vienna is pretty much Khrushchev in the driver's seat, reacting to the impressions that he got at the summit.
Right. And I think the big thing about Fulbright, I mean, to this day, Fulbright scholars are American students that are sent to study in generally Great Britain, but Europe.
Yeah.
And some come to the European students come to the United States. He is not the American exceptionalist. He is we have allies, we should use them. And it's important to use them in the context of Berlin because everybody talks about the meetings during World War II of, okay, it feels a little like they let Churchill be there.
Yeah.
Fulbright fully says we want these other perspectives, even if these countries are in the middle of decolonization and are no longer like the sun has started to set on these empires.
Yeah.
They're our friends and they control as much as Berlin as we do.
Well, and I think with Fulbright's also going to recognize that, they have a more immediate stake in whatever happens because, America's pretty far away from Russia if you discount, how close Alaska is to Siberia. From the European perspective, they're right on the front door.
Right. And I think if Khrushchev doesn't come away from Vienna with the same opinion of Kennedy, so in our timeline, that very much leads almost directly to the Berlin crisis, which is basically the United States wouldn't deal with the East Germans because we didn't recognize East Germany as a separate country. The Soviets force us to deal with them, and basically this leads to the Berlin Wall. Does that change if Khrushchev isn't feeling pushed to do something in the way that he sees an opportunity he needs to take advantage of?
So I think Khrushchev's always going to want to unify Berlin because just if you look at a map, it's a perfectly rational thing from his perspective. You've got the city that's firmly in the Soviet occupation zone that they don't control the entirety of, and in a sort of communist sort of ideological view, you don't want the polluting influence of capitalist Western powers in the middle of this power base you're trying to develop and centralize.
I mean, just to kind of describe it a little bit, during the occupation, after World War II, Berlin was split up, but you could still easily travel between them.
Yeah.
And the issue was this. East Germany was spending a lot of time and a lot of money educating engineers and doctors. And then
Who were then leaving.
They were leaving, but the thing is, they were taking a subway to leave or taking a city bus to leave. It's one thing to stop people from crossing in the kind of the border between East Germany, West Germany, but it's a completely different thing within the city of Berlin, just
Yeah.
because the city was still functional as people being able to move back and forth.
Yeah.
That was the big deal there.
Yeah. So I can certainly see Khrushchev still doing something like a Berlin Wall, or at least, some version of a wall, even if it's not, the big concrete monolith that it kind of became in our timeline. Just because I think Khrushchev still has that impression of Kennedy as being kind of soft. I think if you have Fulbright bringing France and Britain to the table, Khrushchev recognizes, okay, there is a diplomatic front against me. It's not just Americans and the Soviets at the table. But I think he, like you said, the French and the British are in the middle of decolonizing. So I think he still kind of makes the gamble that, the Europeans are distracted, the Americans young and inexperienced. I don't have to put all my chips on the table and try and play something, but I'm going to make a move just to test and see the reaction to gauge what the situation is going forward.
So the Berlin crisis still kind of happens the way it does.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Here's the next thing. And this was really interesting because I have to admit, I kind of flipped it on him. You think so? Dylan kind of talked a little bit about ranges of missiles and the ability of the Soviet Union to actually attack London and Paris.
Yeah,
but not the United States.
Yeah, the basic tactical mismatch that is happening kind of behind the scenes at the Berlin crisis and at the Vienna summit is, so the US and Russia both know that Russia outnumbers the US in ground forces. They've got like a 2-to-1 advantage basically. So if it comes to
just
a ground
2-to-1
war on the continent, is it 3-to-1? I couldn't remember. I was trying to be conservative.
I think it's bigger. Yeah.
So basically, the U.S. if it comes to a ground war in Germany or in Europe, the Soviets have a numerical, conventional military force advantage, greatly outnumber. Like the odds are hugely in their favor. What the Americans have, thanks to all these funny guys with swastika armbands and glasses that came over after World War II, is they have much more experience in missile technology. So the Soviets primarily focus on kind of short and medium range ballistic missiles. The Americans are much more focused on long range because obviously they've got to get across the Pacific and they still want to be able to hit the Soviets without having to land and set up that many installations in Europe. So the Soviets recognize that we might have a troops on the ground superiority, which we need because we've got this whole buffer state thing that we're setting up in Eastern Europe. But the Americans can hit us and we cannot hit them back in terms of missiles. Also, fun fact at this point, when the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is what we're leading up to, kicks off, I want to say it was Allen Dulles who was basically he recognized that missiles in Cuba were a bad thing, but in the long term, he didn't really see what the need was for all the consternation because it was about 40 missiles that the Soviet Union moved into Cuba, I think. But if you take a big picture, Dulles' perspective was the U.S. has 5,000 versus 300 that were already there. So he's like, do we really care that much if it bumps up by a couple dozen compared to 5,000 missiles that we have?
Well, Dulles was out.
No, that might not have been Dulles.
Because he was out of CIA because of the Bay of Pigs.
Correct. Hey. Yeah, but it was the CIA director, I think.
Guess what?
Allen Dulles is still around.
Yes. And by the way, I think the interesting thing here is I'm going to try and not get too technical. The United States saw and knew about the medium range missiles. We missed a decent amount of the tactical missiles. i.e., the nuclear missiles that are launched like battlefield.
Yeah.
We had no idea they were there.
Yeah. But from the perspective that they had, they're like,
Right.
oh, this is a drop in the bucket either way. So there's a certain camp that's like, why do we even care about a few more missiles?
But this is also very strange lobbying, where it's like, we won't get our hair mussed, but I think it's the Air Force general in Dr. Strangelove, which I'm not saying we won't get our hair mussed, but it'll be only a couple million casualties at the top. Like,
it's a very Curtis LeMay statement.
Yes. It's
and Curtis LeMay was one who favored just basically bombing Cuba into the Stone Age to get rid of those missiles.
Absolutely. Now this was an interesting. So Dylan kind of approached it from the Russian perspective of, well, of course, they need to be able to threaten the United States. They want those missiles in Cuba. But to flip it, in our timeline, Fidel Castro has been invaded already.
Mm-hmm.
In our alternate timeline, he hasn't. And the question is, hey, listen, man, if you let in these missiles, if you weren't a target, you are now.
Mm-hmm.
The question being, if Castro hadn't been through the Bay of Pigs, does he allow in the missiles?
Yeah, and when Chris first threw that at me, I was initially thinking, yeah, of course they do. But actually, the more you think about it, without the Bay of Pigs, that really throws Castro kind of into the hard line, everybody's out to get me, I have to pony up to the Soviets. I do think Castro kind of ends up being, obviously he feels slighted by the U.S. because all he was trying to do is, from his perspective, basically give a true voice to Cubans, notwithstanding the fact that he's going to cancel the elections that he was supposedly going to call. But he very much still kind of feels just like a slight, he kind of very much strikes you in this couple year period with no Bay of Pigs. He kind of presents almost as a Ho Chi Minh type of figure, where he's saying, all I'm trying to do is take care of my people, and the Americans just want to kill me for it and destabilize and just go back to the way things were. Kind of like Ho Chi Minh felt after Versailles at the end of World War I. He's saying, all I want is for Vietnamese people to have a seat at the table and a voice.
I mean, more so in like 46, 45, 46, when he is
you're right.
Literally cribbing the American Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, exactly. But it's very much that kind of figure. So I can almost see Khrushchev still trying to get the missiles in there. And honestly, I can kind of see the Cuban Missile Crisis being Khrushchev, because the Soviets are sending oil to Cuba. Mm-hmm. I can almost see Khrushchev trying to insist that missile placement is a condition of at least some continued oil support, and Castro just being stuck in the middle, trying to keep these Soviet tankers from coming in, bringing these missiles, and the Americans looking angrily over his shoulder.
Because again, like you suggested, the Guatemalans aren't going anywhere. They're still there.
Yeah. And in this administration with Fulbright, the U.S. is very much taking yes, we don't like Cuba, but we're going to wait and see. Basically, for once in the Cold War, the U.S. is actually going to see how the dominoes fall before they start knocking down more of them. So I think that changes, at the very least, the tenor of the Cuban Missile Crisis, especially as it concerns Cuba, but it also changes the tenor of the U.S. versus Soviet conversation, because the Soviets are seen less as an insidious partner and more, to Fulbright's perspective, an imperialist power, whether they're communist or not, trying to force their whims on somebody who is in America's traditional Monroe Doctrine sphere of influence.
Also, again, very much against the wishes of that independent country.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think, whether it's as tense as it is in our timeline or whether it calms down a little bit earlier, I think the Cuban Missile Crisis is at least drastically different because you have Castro kind of painted more as a sympathetic figure. Now, granted, I'm not saying the CIA is not still going to try and kill him with explodable cigars and stuff like that, but Castro, at least I think, ironically enough, gets a little bit of sympathy and a little bit of leeway from the Americans because, and Castro's smart enough to know this, he's going to play this card up to high heaven.
Mm-hmm.
But he's going to get a little bit of sympathy from the Americans and kind of buy himself some time by saying, look, I didn't want any of this. The Soviets just came in here trying to throw their muscle around. And I think the real question is, however that's resolved, what does that do from Kennedy's perspective in terms of what does that make his track record start to look like? Because he's only got Vienna, which the Berlin Wall has still gone up. So arguably kind of a loss, even if it reaffirmed American commitment to continental allies. And then now this Cuban Missile Crisis where, yeah, the missiles probably aren't there, but it's very much, I think the broader electorate is going to kind of see Kennedy because they don't see the behind the scenes diplomacy. They're going to kind of question whether Kennedy's sort of soft on communism, at least from a global perspective, because the populace just sees all this stuff happening and they're like, wait, I thought this was all about the Cold War. Why do the Russians keep getting what they want, or at least kind of sort of winning, because they don't see all the negotiation and diplomacy that, is always behind the scenes that results in these small wins that kind of keep the status quo. And so I think that kind of gets us to, because really those are the big things in the lead up to 1963, at least from the foreign policy front, which is mostly what Kennedy's going to have in terms of credentials in the lead up to his reelection campaign. You do have things like the civil rights movement starting to kick off. You've got, desegregation coming in. Like in the last episode, we talked about the forced integration of Little Rock High School. You've got the University of Mississippi, Bobby Kennedy.
We're at
the Marshals and the Guard in there.
We're at the point where, to a large extent, segregation has become illegal.
Yes.
Now we're dealing with convincing the Southerners to do it.
Yes. It's become not a legal question, but a social question. And that is still very much kind of up in the air. It's becoming kind of the home front conversation du jour. Because this is in 63 is kind of when the freedom rides have happened. You've got some very dramatic escorts of black students onto segregated campuses with military escort. You're kind of starting to get the sit-ins in places like St. Augustine and some other stuff. But it's really, the March on Washington doesn't happen really until the summer of 63.
The speech was August 28th, 63.
Yeah. So this is kind of right as Kennedy's gearing up for re-election. So this is starting to happen, but it's kind of not quite in the mind of the American public as an electorate issue until kind of it's starting to come up right now. But that gets us to, I think, the big question of this episode, which is November 11th, 1963. So
23rd.
Oh, it's 11/23/63. I always get the dates confused between Veterans Day 11/11 and
yeah, that was it. Yeah. By the way, just to stress how everything is going on all at once. Remember August of 63, because I'm going to bring us back to that later.
Yeah. But Kennedy basically in late 63 is planning this trip to Dallas because it's kind of seen as his unofficial kickoff for his reelection campaign, because the election's going to be in 64. So that's why he's going to Dallas, especially to shore up. There's some kind of warring between some fractions of the Southern and specifically Texas interstate or intrastate Democratic Party that he's trying to go down and play peacemaker and kind of help shore that up. Because remember, Kennedy still has to court the Southern Democratic Party.
I mean,
and
I'd have to look it up again, but if you think about how many votes Texas represents,
it's not as many as now, but it's a big chunk.
Yeah.
And that brings us to a theory that I had for a certain someone who all of a sudden is back relevant in the political field. But in the first episode, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, you finish your thing, and then I have something came to my mind.
Okay. Yeah. So in the first episode, we talked about how if Johnson doesn't win the Senate election in 48, he's going to wander into wilderness for a little bit, kind of lick his wounds, figure out what he wants to do. He is still very much a big player in Texas politics. And I think Johnson very realistically could become governor of Texas. And there's a couple of different gubernatorial elections. There's one in 57. And then there's another one in late 62 where the governor takes office in early 63. That election, the governor who took power in 57 was trying to win a fourth term. And so actually he took power in 54. That governor was trying to win a fourth term, which I think at the time was almost unheard of outside of like Sam Houston. Mm-hmm. Like Texas at that point had only had one 4-term governor. It was almost unheard of. So I think Johnson, who's been behind the scenes and probably holding some state offices to keep his hands in the Democratic Texas party machine, I think he runs for governor and wins in 62, making him governor in 63 when Kennedy is trying to come to Texas. And I can keep going, but I want to see what you have, what your thing was.
Well, the only thing is this. If Johnson is governor, there is no split within the Texas Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think you're right.
That's the one thing, but Johnson is still a huge grandee who's going to deliver this state.
Yes, and I think that changes the motivation for why Kennedy's there, which I think also changes what happens when he's there, because if you have a less fractured Texas Democratic base, Kennedy, if all he's got to do is kind of court Johnson, who is basically the Tammany Hall leader of his day in Texas, basically is the equivalent, is what he's going to be. Kennedy doesn't necessarily feel the need for a motorcade to drive through all of Dallas to show himself to the direct people so much, because Johnson kind of helps offset that, because Johnson controls so much of the Democratic machine. So Kennedy still goes to Dallas in 1963, but instead of a motorcade, he's going to steal a page from Lyndon Johnson's 48 campaign. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the Johnson City Windmill is back in action. I don't remember if I talked about this in the first episode, but in the 48 election, Lyndon Johnson campaigned flying around in a helicopter that he called the Johnson City Windmill. At one point in the 48 campaign, he literally landed the windmill, which was his helicopter, at a Coke Stevenson rally. So the man's got a flair for the dramatic. So, and I'm sure if Johnson is governor, the Johnson City Windmill is going to become kind of a nationally known shtick that he has. So I'm proposing that Kennedy and Johnson actually ride in a aerocade of helicopters with Kennedy in the Johnson City Windmill, with LBJ. Marine One, which was in use during Eisenhower's administration, is still going to be there because you've got some security concerns. You don't want it too obvious where the president is actually flying. So I think Marine One is going to be in this aerocade. Kennedy and Johnson are going to be in the Johnson City Windmill. And instead of a motorcade flying through or rolling through downtown Dallas, it's kind of a low-fly helicopter parade. So people can still see him and everybody waves, but you get this nice, because you have to remember, Kennedy is the TV president. He won the first televised debate against Richard Nixon and kind of has this, he's almost like a social media president today, where he's got this panache. He understands this new form of media. So Kennedy, and I think Johnson as well, are going to love the idea of this dramatic touchdown for the newsreels of the Johnson City Windmill, for Kennedy to walk out into the Dallas trade market and give this speech to kick off his campaign.
And it's interesting to me that Johnson was the helicopter person here, because it also seems that this kind of gels pretty well with Kennedy wanting to portray himself almost as Jetson space age
very
kind of stuff.
Space age modern. Yeah. It really kind of plays all the cards well, I think. So the big change that comes out of this is, well, Kennedy gets to give that speech and kicks off his reelection campaign. So that gets us to what's next, because like we keep talking about, so many things are happening. I'm starting to lose track of what's happening.
I'm going to make it worse. I'm going to make it worse for you because we are. You took us up to that November 22nd, 63. Remember how I said remember August? Let's go back to August of 63.
Okay.
And the American supported dictator of South Vietnam.
Yes. I knew we were getting to it somewhere. I just couldn't remember the timeline.
Yep. Again, we have trouble. I understand that at home. So in August of 1963, basically there are a series of riots because the Diem regime, Catholic, in a predominantly Buddhist country, passed a law saying you cannot display religious flags, and then promptly enforced it only against Buddhists and not Catholics when I want to say bishop was visiting. It led to massive protest, and it led to, for those of you that are familiar with the image of the Buddhist monk burning himself. That's when this was. And this was a massive crisis in the country. And it kind of led, if you look at the paper trail here, it led to the United States working with its contacts in the South Vietnamese army saying, all right, guys, we realize that because what you had here, kind of interesting to think about this in comparison to the Castro thing of the tail wagging the dog, happened so many times in the Cold War, which is Diem thinking, hey, listen, the Americans are committed to me. I'm their guy. So I don't actually need to listen to them. I can keep doing what I'm doing and kind of disobeying.
Take them along for the ride.
Exactly. And in our timeline, the Americans kind of communicated to the South Vietnamese army, we wouldn't have an issue if you guys did something.
Yeah.
And again, the timeline is so important here because in the beginning of November, again, like 3 weeks before where we just were in Dallas, the South Vietnamese army in our timeline mounts a coup. The United States had said we don't want anything to physically happen to Diem, but you can remove him. But he and his brother wound up. I love, and I'm shamelessly stealing this. A phrase in one of our podcasts that we love, connected to God's Wi-Fi in the back of an APC. Wound up getting shot because they're trying to escape. In our timeline, and one of the things that Dylan and I discussed, we don't think that's necessarily going to develop that way, right? What we discussed was kind of a situation where, and I'm going to hand it over to Dylan to describe. Those of you that have heard of quiet quitting, this would be noisy quitting.
Yeah. So to analogize it, the way I explain this to Chris is, so, the U.S. is looking at Diem and saying, okay, we don't really like this guy. We don't like the writing on the wall. He's just going to do what he wants to do and kind of, take us along for the ride. So the U.S. is going to steal a page from the attorney handbook and do what amounts to a noisy withdrawal. And what that is, attorneys work for their clients. Their clients can fire them. The attorney has to withdraw from representation. They can agree to terminate representation, or when your client is doing something, very that would require you to be unethical or do something illegal or stuff like that, you can't represent them anymore because you have an ethical duty not to further crimes or unethical practices or whatever. The problem for attorneys is confidentiality. You can't tell people what they're trying to do, with a few exceptions, but you can't generally just be like, hey, this guy's going to go bomb, a school bus full of children. I'm out. You still have to keep their confidence, but you can do what's called a noisy withdrawal. So if you're in court and your client's about to perjure himself, you can say, Judge, I really, really, really cannot continue with this. I need you to let me off the hook so that my client can either hire another attorney or do whatever crazy thing he's planning on doing that I can't tell you about. That's kind of what the U.S. is going to start doing. They're going to, especially in South Vietnamese and Vietnamese politics more general, they're going to kind of let it be known that we no longer wish to affiliate ourselves with DM. We will happily resume discussions with whatever government takes place after DM,
because
we no longer want to associate ourselves with it.
And to kind of put a finer point on that, in the 1954 Geneva Accords that ended the French war in Vietnam, there was supposed to be a national election to determine a new government.
Yeah.
The United States looked at that and said, Ho Chi Minh's going to win. So we can't let that happen.
Yeah.
And so we support all these other people, Bao Dai and then No Dinh Diem and all of these things, preventing it. The United States version of this noisy withdrawal is to say, hey, DM, how about that election? Maybe, want to do that sooner or later?
You remember that thing, that thing that you said you were going to do the thing?
Yeah. And because I have a steel trap memory for time frames and do love symmetry so much, what we suggested was this kind of accord happens when in August of 1964, the United States kind of says, all right, listen, we've had enough. There need to be elections. Start that process.
Yeah. So what that results in is, as Kennedy is leading into the election of 1964, you have, yet another diplomatic negotiation card of, yes, these elections haven't happened, but in Vietnam, this other front of the Cold War, we have negotiated a diplomatic solution. Hasn't happened yet, but we've got the commitment to it. Like, this is in play. So there's no military conflict. We're keeping a simmer on this pot. It's not boiling over. We can continue to focus on Russia. So Kennedy is gradually kind of burnishing his foreign policy credentials in advance of the 1964 election.
And by the way, we think it's still, especially after everything that's happened, it's still going to be Goldwater on the other side, coming out and kind of saying, you guys are weak. Yeah. You're not doing enough. And, we need to fight the communists on every school board, on every little acre of whatever. We need to be out there kind of interventionisting all over the world. And in our timeline, this was one of the first major television election ads, the Daisy ad. Johnson made the exact same argument, which is, listen, we're confronting, in effect, his argument was, we're confronting Russian power, but we're not doing it stupidly. The Daisy ad kind of says, hey, listen, like, you cannot trust Goldwater with the button. You cannot trust him with nuclear weapons because, like Dylan was saying, the United States does not have conventional parity with the Soviet Union. You know what that means? We're going to start using what we have very quickly. That was a big concern, which is if there's a conventional conflict, the first thing the United States has to do is to start throwing around nukes. And once that happens, the Russians start throwing around nukes very quickly, and it escalates very quickly. And there was, even in our timeline, there was the idea that we're just doing it smart.
Yeah, and I think that becomes kind of the tenor of the election campaign is, at least as far as the Cold War goes. It's okay. What is the strategy? Is it hardline? Stanley Kubrick-esque, just blow everything up and just, if we're gonna do it, let's start fighting, or the Kennedy Fulbright nuanced. No, this is a diplomatic affair that can be solved by diplomacy. It requires subtlety to contain the Russians and not necessarily outright defeat them. That'll waste a bunch of resources.
I'm waving my hands around because Dylan just said the word I wanted to talk about, which is containment.
Containment? Yeah.
The kind of architect of containment, George Kennan, in our timeline, testified before the Fulbright Foreign Relations Committee and said we were stupid to go into Vietnam because it's not. We don't need to worry about it. Yeah, that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I think Fulbright very much, again, because of his European focus, is going to be saying, why would we bog ourselves down in all these not irrelevant but tertiary theaters when we need to keep the focus on Europe? Let's use diplomacy so that we can focus our attention and focus our essential resources on that.
And also, by the way, leverage the resources of our friends where we need to. Kind of, I think the best example of this is the two early hot Cold Wars, which are Korea and Vietnam. In Korea, whatever else you want to say about the level of commitment, the Western world was there.
Yeah, it was a UN war, not just a strictly United States war.
In Vietnam, Johnson tried to get other people. He eventually convinced the South Vietnamese and the Australians, I believe, to actually send anything.
Yeah. So, and I think the only other thing that I want to kind of touch base on, more to kind of set up for the next episode, because I think we're going to end it with the election of 64, because that's when, after 64, that's when you start getting a lot of the home front stuff that the 60s is kind of known for. And I just want to bring one thing up on that front to kind of set up for post 64. And that is, Goldwater is the beginning of, and his vice president, William Miller, Goldwater is the beginning of this Republican turn to what's called the Southern strategy that you would see Nixon pretty much take and run with and basically change into the modern kind of electoral map geographically that we see today, which is win disenchanted white voters in the South over to the Republican Party. So I think on the home policy front, you're going to see Republicans start to move that way. But Kennedy, like I talked about earlier, has good old brother Bobby, who is helping him kind of in combination with this, diplomatic foreign policy strategy. I am enforcing the law as it is. I am integrating the Southern schools. Basically, he's going to start making advocacy for civil rights his big platform, which in our timeline, Johnson, after Kennedy's assassination, passed the Civil Rights Act of 64. I think Kennedy doesn't have a Civil Rights Act of 64 yet, but I think that's going to become one of his domestic policy platforms in a re-election campaign is, hey, I've got the Cold War contained diplomatically. We need to address the home front, and I'm going to pass, because he doesn't have Johnson advocating for the kind of Great Society, welfare, social program type stuff. Kennedy is going to be much more purely focused on Civil Rights Act as his domestic policy.
So, to kind of use European terms, more of a social liberal than a social democrat.
Yes, exactly. And I think because of Kennedy's diplomatic sort of accomplishments, and I think because of the bubbling civil rights sort of situation, I think Kennedy's still going to win in 64. I think everybody's going to be too scared of especially after the close call of what became the Cuban Missile Crisis, they're going to see Russia as much more of the main aggressor, not all these other domino theory kind of conflicts. And so the containment question, rather than the question is going to come down to, do we want to get in an outright war with Russia like Barry Goldwater wants, or do we want to save American lives, try and use diplomacy like we've already been doing to some effect?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to end up winning Kennedy and Fulbright a second term in 64.
I agree. I think they do win in 64. And I think we might have another episode coming up.
I think so.
About what that leads to.
Yep, I think so. Chris, that's a very good way to tie this all up. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap this one up and bring it to a close?
Not yet.
Okay, you're saving them all for part 3?
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. I always kind of in my head, I'm like, all right, when's the next election? We're going to end there. And then, because, hey, by the way, there's one more election to talk about, which is the
Vietnam. Yeah. So I think that sets us up very nicely for a lot of stuff in part 3. I got my Johnson City Windmill back in here, so that was really what I wanted out of this episode. So I think we've kind of got everything wrapped up at a good stopping point. So ladies and gentlemen, if you like this episode, if you have thoughts, if you think something differently is going to happen in this timeline, leave a comment, let us know, hop on the Discord, tell us what you thought, tell us what your theories are. If you have ideas for episodes, feel free to leave them in the Discord as well. And as always, we will sign off with our usual question, which is, Chris, if you should happen to come across a fork in time, what should you do?
Fly over it in a helicopter.
Yes. That's it, everyone. That's a wrap.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.